It really has been something that has been a massive shift, right? I think a lot of people talk about how AI is bigger than the internet, things like that. Obviously, depending what you're talking about, I would agree in some cases. I think the biggest thing for us is that it's a sign of the times, right? This is just a massive inflection point for everyone in this ecosystem affecting others. We've actually doubled down on it as a result of this shift. We feel that the proliferation of energy, and even though you're seeing these energy markets right now at a 2-year low pricing, many experts are saying that's going to be 3 to 5 years. And the reason why, because of natural gas and energy pricing. You may know it comes from two things: natural gas storage and weather. And of course, we know that AI is going to eat all the natural gas. And so that's why a lot of experts are saying, hey, I know one expert in the PJM grid has said this pricing is not going down for 5 years. I just heard that 2 weeks ago. So that's part of why we've doubled down on it, because we're seeing the inflection point and we're responding to it. This is Vince Bradley with Abundant IoT, and you're walking the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast.
Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg, host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. Today I'm welcoming Vince Bradley, who is CEO of Abundant IoT in Southern California. Vince, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Joshua. I'm really looking forward to it.
Looking forward to it as well. So for those that are not familiar with Abundant, could you give us the quick elevator intro?
Absolutely. So Abundant IoT, abundant is an energy word. And so the start of our journey about 5 years ago was looking at energy in general. And over the last couple of years, we have moved a little closer to the data center space. You can see Equinix do a lot with them and the whole data center ecosystem now. But essentially, Abundant IoT, the idea is that we connect everything, all the energy services together via sensors. So that's the high level.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, when we were planning this, you mentioned that complex products tend to be a big go-to-market challenge for you. And in an industry, when you think specifically about energy and data centers, complexity can really be a deal killer. So how do you simplify that? How do you simplify the concept of what you provide to data center operators and enterprise data centers without losing credibility?
Great question. To first answer it, I will say that when I said complex product, it was more related to, bringing this IoT conversation in and connecting them to the energy. So that was what I was referring to. However, as it relates to the power conversation, that's also been something that we really have found the simplicity makes way more sense. And so specifically, we become experts at on-site sourcing. So we're able to source on-site generation, whether it be generators, solar, batteries, demand response, all of those products. So I guess the best answer on the data center side is focus on the power.
It seems to be one of the top 2 or 3 constraints all the time. And unless you're in the GPU business, it probably is the number 1 constraint all the time. Not to mention it used to be land, not land anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just talking to someone who said, we bought the land, now we have the community meeting, and then we're looking at the power. And these things are all kind of changing, right, as we go. So yes, I agree.
Yeah, the community meetings can be a really, really big deal. I'm in South Florida, about an hour north of Miami. There was a big project that just got derailed a couple of weeks ago. I had someone on who's working on a big project in Phoenix, a lot of attention, and regardless of where you're located, to how to win over the community stakeholders and how to navigate around the potential moratoria.
It's been tough. I was speaking with a major developer for a hyperscaler, and they were telling me that they're spending 70% of their time on those issues. So literally over 2/3 of their time on those issues.
Yeah, a lot of trust that needs to be built up, a lot of education that needs to happen. It's interesting. I had someone on who works in a marketing leadership role from Cyrus One about 2 years ago, and I think they were a little bit out ahead of this, where they identified it was like elected officials, regulators, utility companies, and community stakeholders. And community stakeholders was actually number four. It's pretty clear now that the community stakeholders is jumping over pretty much everyone else. It's a lot more concrete, a lot more tangible to educate and build trust with people that do this all day. But when you look at homeowners and residents and things like that, there's definitely a lot of challenges. One that's probably a little more hyper relevant to what you work on with your clients is we talk about AI density. It's really causing a lot of companies to have to go back to the drawing board, putting a lot of unprecedented pressures on power grids and data centers. How has the shift to high density AI data centers changed how you go about your go to market strategy for growing Abundant IoT?
Great question. It really has been something that has been a massive shift, right? I think a lot of people talk about how AI is bigger than the internet, things like that. Obviously, depending what you're talking about, I would agree on some cases. I think the biggest thing for us is that it's a sign of the times, right? This is just a massive inflection point for everyone in this ecosystem affecting others. We've actually doubled down on it as a result of this shift. We feel that the proliferation of energy, and even though you're seeing these energy markets right now at a 2-year low pricing, many experts are saying that's going to be 3 to 5 years. And the reason why, because of natural gas and energy pricing. You may know it comes from two things: natural gas storage and weather. And of course, we know that AI is going to eat all the natural gas. And so that's why a lot of experts are saying, hey, I know one expert in the PJM grid has said this pricing is not going down for 5 years. I just heard that 2 weeks ago. So that's part of why we've doubled down on it, because we're seeing the inflection point and we're responding to it.
Now, which parts specifically are you double downing on? I know you mentioned that a lot of solar, a lot of what you're doing with lighting didn't really have this IoT component 10 years ago. I know you mentioned having a more holistic approach to all this. Which parts, in terms of doubling down, have you found to be especially relevant?
Mostly the power, mostly the on-site generation. We have now become experts at sourcing generators, turbines, fuel cells, linear generators, etc. We have hundreds of wholesalers that we tap in a marketplace. So I would say power is number one. And I would say things related to power, like demand response, is a big one in the DCO space. Decommissioning, our ability to help people move in and out of the data centers, is something else that's been resonating a lot as well. So yeah, kind of a focus on power and the related products to it.
Interesting. So that wasn't the primary focus of Abundant if we go back, say, 5 years?
No, in fact, it wasn't even really on the radar 5 years ago. I mean, to be clear, we had said, yeah, we're going to sell generators. We started selling generators 4 years ago. But what I'm saying is the level we're at now, I mean, we're actually focusing on the power today, if that makes sense. So yeah, the original vision, it's definitely morphed. And so kind of one way to look at this with Abundant is two different divisions. We have on-grid over here, which is all of the IoT, the grid power, and all the related services. And then over here, we have the off-grid division. And this is taking off really fast. And our investors are super interested, and we're moving quickly. So hopefully that helps, makes more sense.
Of the off-grid, where are you seeing the most interest? Where are you seeing the most success with projects? Is turbines and natural gas or solar, or what's been the most successful for you and your clients?
I mean, as it relates to the data centers, solar is not going to be as big of a factor. Also, the incentives for that kind of slowed down. However, incentives for green fuel machines out of the OBBB a year ago received a 30% ITC tax credit. So that is definitely an incentive to help save money. The other thing we've been able to do is with some of our wholesale EPCs, we can deliver an additional 40 to 50% tax credit. So there's a lot we can do to defray the cost. But at the end of the day, it really is going back to looking at what the customer wants. Where is their journey needing to take them? How are they future-proofing their business? And that's essentially what we do, Joshua, is we help businesses to future-proof. That's a good way to think about it.
So it's an interesting question, interesting topic when they come in having an idea of what future proofing looks like. The reality, though, is we're finding increasingly a lot of companies are struggling to get in early enough to shape the criteria. It used to be like 10 years ago, buyers would do a lot of research on their own. They'd look up a lot of topical interest information on search engines. They'd ask questions from their peers on LinkedIn. They'd watch YouTube videos. They'd attend webinars. They'd listen to podcasts. They'd read reviews. All of that still goes on. But now we have everyone doing analyst grade research instantaneously on Copilot and Claude and Gemini and ChatGPT. So in this world now where it used to be half of that journey was over before you met a prospect. Now it's like 80, 90%, sometimes more than 90% of the research and decision making is over before you meet a prospect. So what do you do to educate buyers before they get to that first initial sales conversation to make sure that you're stacking the decks in favor of your approach as opposed to letting someone else frame all the criteria?
Great question. Old school, doing the webinar, doing the show, things like that, right? They can still work if they're part of the drip. And this is what we really learn now is the work is coming now. It's our ability to make sure that we've got our products and services current and updated throughout our website and the internet so that when they search, they have accurate information quickly. I think that's really the ball, is keeping your stuff current so that when people are searching on you, they get good information. There is nothing worse than customers that come to you and say, oh, I didn't even know you did that, right? So as an example, you go and look at Abundant in the website or you search AI, you find a lot of information about power because we want to make sure they know about that. So I guess my answer is making sure that you're completely current on all of your products and services, that you have a journey for your customer in mind that you can articulate that way. Because to your point, a lot of this is done before you ever talk to someone. So I love that a lot of times we're getting reached out to and literally just being asked, okay, we need 50 megawatts. We've already looked at nat gas generators. We don't have natural gas in these areas. So we need to look at this technology. We also want some renewable tech. So we want to look at fuel cells, linear generators, and all of these things in the conversation. And at the end of the day, you just have to have everything buttoned up all the time. So I guess the best answer is being current all the time on your information.
Yeah, that's a great point. I always talk with clients, regardless of whether they're in the executive level or tactical at chief commercial, chief revenue, chief marketer. Like if someone goes to your site and the copyright year is 3 years ago and the blog hasn't been updated in 2 or 3 years, it's a terrible look. But the bigger issue is now that they're doing so much of this decision making before they ever get to your conversation, you may not even get a second chance. Like if they don't, like you mentioned, if they don't even realize that you do something or the information isn't comprehensive enough and the reality is it's such a big lift now for traditional salespeople to even get to that initial meeting because they're in competition with the kind of information the prospects are getting from all the Gen AI tools.
And then I would add, on the back end of that, we're very careful once we're engaged to actually do a lot of work that others don't do. Here's a very specific example. So we typically get an AHI client. They have a needs doc. They have some information they've given us, do some deal registration, et cetera, as a discovery. What we actually do is proactively go and scrape their website for corporate sustainability and or ESG. And we work that information before we ever talk to them. So in a similar way, we have done our homework on them. They love it. And for that, we have a very good batting average because we're showing up with the information that they want and need without them even asking for it. So I just say that as a tip for people that are watching, listening, to take it to the next level. Not only being ready for the engagement, but also once you get engaged, to actually be proactive with that client.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to get some insights as long as their website has stayed relatively current. I remember years ago, I don't know who gave me this tip, but like the idea of don't go into a meeting without looking at the last 3 posts that someone put on their LinkedIn profile, or don't go into a meeting without looking at the last 3 posts that they put on their company page, because it gives you an idea of what's top of mind for that person, or at least the person that's controlling the social media brand, and it gives you an idea of what kinds of content they tend to engage with, what's relevant, what's top of mind for them. I think a lot of these tools and tactics that kind of gave you a competitive advantage 8 or 10 years ago, the generative AI has just taken them from nice to have to pretty much like it's just not cutting it enough just to do that. It's the question is like, what can you do to get the deeper insights? And the playbook that's been working for a lot of the companies we've seen over the last several years is using education, because when someone meets with a salesperson in a sales context, a lot of times they're they're reluctant to open up. They're sharing, and so they feel it's a little bit adversarial. But when they meet with someone who's teaching, training, education, trust building, consulting, they tend to be a little bit more open to sharing, interacting, a little bit more relaxed, not as reserved. So the challenge with a lot of this for a lot of companies that have used most of the sales-led playbook for years is it's tough to change the culture of the company, to all of a sudden say that, okay, we're going to do a lot more educational webinars, a lot more lunch and learns, a lot more breakfast seminars, fewer booths, a lot fewer golf tournaments. It's a big, big change for a lot of companies. And for big ones, for larger companies, they've gotten away with keeping their playbooks largely the same for years. I think for smaller companies, it's a challenge to stand out. Have you seen any of that resistance on your side?
Well, I think when you talk about the playbook and just that whole theme, speed is key. And I mean, going back to what you were saying, table stakes, and it's a given that you're doing all of these things that were just a nice to have before, right? Now, it's a necessity now to be able to get that information and to be able to engage immediately with them. But when I say speed is key, I talk about the sourcing expertise, right? And sort of like, why is it that we have to be so quick once we're engaged? What we have found typically is that even 2 days, if we don't respond the next day, like 30% of those leads are already dead. And it's mind-blowing how fast these people are looking for this information sometimes. So again, are bad for not getting back the next day or the same day. But it's just a very interesting thing because we never noticed that in the past when the follow-up was a few days later. Never really noticed such a big hit. It's fascinating.
I think generative AI in general has accelerated people's expectations of instant gratification in a massive, massive way. I think the hyper-connected nature, globalization, everything has also done it as well. That in most cases, when the response time isn't fast enough, it's a combination of culture and it's a combination of staffing. Because in theory, if you're dealing with large enough deals, any rational company, take an extreme example, 50 million, $500 million deals, any rational company will put enough staffing on there to make sure that speed is a competitive advantage. A lot of times what ends up happening though is you kind of have like these borderline areas where the unit economics aren't quite as strong or people don't realize just the speed. The reality is anyone that's in a data center development role right now on the construction and the real estate side is under such intense pressure to move mountains as ridiculously fast as possible that it's flowing down to everything in the supply chain.
Supply chain's crushed. I agree with that statement. It's almost had to be rebuilt in terms of the way it operates now. So that's been one of the biggest challenges that we've had, because when we go to wholesale, we've got a very deep space there, but we're finding more and more that it's typically we have to go to 2 or 3 wholesalers to get the result. So yeah, it's definitely been crushed and it's being rebuilt. Some progress, but again, like everything else, it's a moving target. So as they're changing it, it's changing. So I guess my point is just being nimble. First of all, speed is super important to be able to react to the opportunities, but also to be able to pivot when someone has a needs requirement that shifts. One of the worst things, and we've seen this, is, oh, okay, we'll get back to you. And then that delay ends up killing the deal. So
Time
I guess
kills all
my
deals, right?
bottom line is just you can't operate fast enough in the power space right now.
Most data center GTM teams are flying completely blind. 83% of your buyer's journey is happening before they even speak with someone from your sales team. The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is powered by DCSMI. We've studied over 1,900 industry leaders to build a diagnostic framework that identifies exactly why deals fall apart and revenue stalls. Stop guessing and start benchmarking. Subscribe now to our weekly Data Center GTM briefing at www.dcsmi.com/briefing. Again, that's dcsmi.com/briefing. BRIEFING. Vince, when you look at others that are in your segment, what is a go-to-market playbook that you still see other companies using that they're just in denial about it no longer working as effectively as it used to, or just not working at all?
That's another great question. What comes to mind is companies that are now 100% relying on AI. Because we've seen that literally with dozens of companies. Because as we know, AI is incredible and it's saving a massive amount of time. However, it makes mistakes. And folks that are relying on AI 100%, it kind of blows my mind how many are doing it. And when you ask them, that's AI. And then it's, oh, okay, well, so that's not really your content, right? Oh, no, we always edit the AI. And I'm like, okay, well, but if it wasn't accurate in the first place. So it's like fact checking and then customizing. But again, just not relying on it. So that's the number one that comes to mind, is just that we've seen many companies doing that. Trying to think of other examples of that. I mean, I think one other is companies that continue to do, I need 3 proposals to make a decision, right? Those days are over. I mean, especially with sourcing expertise and AI, of course, the ability to proliferate a massive amount of information quickly and engineer the network is right at our fingertips today. It's right here. So I guess going back, double clicking on that last point of speed being key, I think a lot of companies still think that they can operate on the same time frames they were. And that is, as we know, gone now.
So when you say that the days of the three proposals are done, are you saying that if you don't get in before that, that you're largely don't have a strategic advantage, or they're not getting three proposals, or what are you finding to be different about how the RFPs operate now compared to a few years ago?
Well, first of all, as you know, and I think everyone knows, unless you wrote the RFP or you know someone that did, and you have a good relationship with them, the RFP process half the time is already decided before it starts. But as it relates to the question, yeah, I think I was talking more about the fact that they're just absolutely totally focused instead of pivoting in the middle of the process, if that makes sense. That's what I kind of referring to.
That makes a lot of sense. The next area I want to talk with you about is technical content. I see a lot of companies in the mid-market that are trying to use content to educate and build trust and generate and accelerate pipeline, but they seem to be reaching a lot of frustration where that technical content doesn't have a clear line of sight to revenue. How have you been able to bridge the gap in recent months between engineering jargon and commercial value? In other words, how do you make sure that your content strategy covers different kinds of functions on the decision committee in a way that actually moves the needle on deals, as opposed to just staying within the comfort zone of your individual team members?
Another good question. And this one, and it goes back to sort of a theme as it relates. I think the theme of the day in terms of what we do is simplicity, right? We've had to simplify everything we're doing all the time, and we have to continue refining that. And so as it relates to that tech gap that you're talking about, we have found that, this may sound a little bit cheesy, but formatting has become huge. So like, for example, I'm big fans of bulleting and bolding and all of this kind of stuff in the copy. You almost have to do it now, because otherwise you get the brain drain. And from my perspective, it's just too noisy, for a customer. It needs to be a simple motion for them. So combining the automation with copy that's understandable and that you can take action on, it's an art. And so trying to think of some specific things that we've done, to address the pace. The buyer pace is what I call it. And as I was saying, it's changed so much.
For your category, do you have a favorite kind of stakeholder that across all different kinds of companies seems to be the best internal champion for you? And conversely, is there a certain kind of stakeholder when that person shows up, it's like the kiss of death for that deal?
I would say CFO and CTO are both champions because we're saving enterprises a lot of money and time. And I would say the CTO would be number two, because we're also helping them future proof and focus on solutions that are going to be longer term as opposed to stopgap. A good example of that would be every day we get asked for diesel generators. And we always say, okay, do you have natural gas? And what would blow your mind is that like at least 34% of the time they do. And so we say, okay, are you aware that diesel is 3 to 5 times more expensive than natural gas? It's way harder to permit, and there's more strict guidelines around it. So we're helping them level up in that way. So, but kind of going back to the point, CTO, CFO are the top titles. I would say that the one that comes in the room that can jack the conversation would be, ironically, the CIO can sometimes do that, because they're going to come in and say, okay, this messaging doesn't make sense for us. Things like that, like going back to the conversation about community meetings, like trying to do press to help out some of these customers, things like that. So, in the C-suite, we usually come in CTO, CFO, and the CIO sometimes blocks.
Interesting. Yeah, and in smaller companies, we a lot of times don't even see that separation of role. But yeah, in larger companies, they're for sure. Usually the CTO is working more on external projects. CIO a lot of times historically has been more internal projects. But yeah, very different agendas depending on who they're reporting to.
Yeah.
Vince, what do you see sales teams consistently getting wrong about buyers in and around data center energy?
Another good one, I would say ignorance to the power crisis.
Really?
They just don't understand
even
what's
this
going
2
on
3
right
years
now.
into this.
I mean, you saw Schmidt, former CEO of Google, go in front of Congress last year, talk about how AI is 3% of the world's energy today, going to 99% in a few years. I mean, and now we know enough about that, and we have done enough research where we validated that. And I'm not going to say it's scary, but if you add the impact of the community meetings to it, right, it's a very tough situation. By the way, just a little bit on a tangent on this for a minute. One of the things we're doing, and I think it's really important, we saw a press release about the linear generators. I think it was from the Air Force. And they were talking about how, it's often lower maintenance, quieter, things like that. And again, going back to that 30% credit on green fuels, right? So now you've got a situation where you've got fuel cells, linear generators, where they can get a better pricing on that. I guess my point here is that it really has become one of these things where customers have no idea how serious this issue is. And it boils down to that. So I think that back to education we talked about earlier makes a massive difference and a massive impact on this issue. So I think that's the biggest gap.
In a lot of ways, because of generative AI, it's getting tougher and tougher to get to those initial meetings. But it seems what's cutting through a lot of times is peers showing up. That's why we see in a lot of companies, chief commercial, chief revenue officers hiring career IT professionals onto a sales team, even if they've never sold before. On the facility side, we see a lot of people hiring career engineers from like hyperscalers and operators, even if they've never been on a sales team before, because at the absolute minimum, you'll have a great subject matter expert at all your events. You'll have a great subject matter expert to bring to these events. And for sure, that person knows the lay of the land with the jobs, the organizations. They've kind of instant street credibility. With all of that in mind, how do existing sales teams reposition themselves? How do they make sure that they're still able to reach that true economic decision maker? How do they get to the C-suite? How do they get to the board members? When it just seems like the larger the company, there's a lot of infrastructure of gatekeepers in place to try to filter you out.
Very tough one. Probably the biggest challenge that we actually have. And I'll just share that a success we recently had was by, the expression taking the bridge from both sides, right? Resonates here. Because if you're talking to procurement, that's great. You're addressing the needs of the company and the organic conversations they're having. But if you're doing that without a green light from the brass, well, we know what happens, right? There's no budget for that. and it just ends. So what we've learned is to approach it from both. And so looking at the relationships that you may have with the brass, and then looking at a relationship you may have with infrastructure or procurement, and connecting that, and not crossing the streams but bringing them together, is also an art that we have been working on. It's not easy, but we found it's incredibly important. So I think, as it relates to your question, one question is, okay, where do you start? Which titles? But my feedback would be, don't look at it as one entry point and that perspective. Look at it as two entry points, at least two, and develop those as you go. So that'd be my best feedback on that one.
Vince, what's a sales or marketing campaign that you've tried recently in the last 6 or 12 months that you were certain was going to be successful, and then it didn't work at all? And then what did you end up doing as a result?
I'm trying to think in the last few years, probably a little bit better than a micro trend in the last year. But this is a good one. So going back to the conversation about, we're an energy company, but we're doing the IoT and the sensors, staying in that tech zone, right? I think looking at, the fact that you've had this situation where energy was the focus, right? Electricity and natural gas, grid-based energy, and it's a recurring revenue product, right? So it's very similar to like telecom. We come from telecom, and we used to sell for all the data centers. That's one of the reasons why we're doing power now. It makes a lot of sense. But going back to that, it's basically a situation where you have these data centers and you've got this energy services, and the energy just didn't really move. So the grid-based electricity and natural gas, to be clear, we had actually a lot of success. But what I'm saying is, it wasn't what you would think. However, once we got into the power, that changed everything, because all of a sudden now those customers, those buyers, want to know what to do. They want that journey. They want that help with the journey and that future proofing. So that's probably the best example I can think of, is where grid-based energy was just okay. Off-grid has been just a massive journey. So that's probably the best one I have for you.
I'm curious too, how did you ultimately discover that? Were you starting to see the patterns come up in initial discovery conversations over and over again? What led you to ultimately find that opportunity to attach your marketing message, sales message focus around that off-grid energy?
Well, I think one of the things that happened with grid-based energy is the biggest deals that we closed were like natural gas and electricity deals where they were paying more than they were at the time that we came to them. Well, in the channel, that's not the same thing, right? So we do a lot of channel work. They're used to get the telecom bill, save some money, help them become more efficient, support them, and then move on. Well, that's not the way it works in energy. In energy, a lot of times it's about saving money over the term of the contract and protecting them from where the market's going. And as I was mentioning before, we're at this 2-year low point right now. Many think it'll be for 5 years. So hopefully that bridges that one as well.
Vince, so many companies throughout the data center, digital infrastructure, critical facilities are often performing outsourcing functions for their clients, and they also tend to be really enamored with the idea of outsourcing and fractional teams, especially when it comes to sales, marketing, and go-to-market. What's a go-to-market function that you believe a company like yours should never outsource, should always be in-house because it's so core to what you do?
Great question. I would say the outsourcing of the customer relationship is just an absolute dangerous thing to do. So we played around with that a little bit, and it's so customized what we're doing. It was just a bad result. So I think at the end of the day, if you're in a specialized space, it's very hard to get the customer experience unless you've got SMEs helping you out with it. Now, AI has helped with that, and it will continue to help with that. But I think there's still a gap right now. I think that the customer experience needs to be excellent, and it isn't if you outsource it.
Actually brings up an interesting related issue when you're talking about that you came from being in the telecommunications space and pivoting into power and subject matter experts. Has it changed quite dramatically what you've done with hiring and recruiting and retraining and training over the last couple of years to account for moving from a somewhat mature industry into an area that's just unprecedented demand now?
It's been literally a complete, 145-degree shift. It's been like, here we go, off the reservation. So absolutely, it's been almost like starting a new company. Obviously divisions often run that way, but in this case, absolutely that way. So we've had to literally forklift a lot of our processes. And it's been a massive pivot in the last couple of years.
Final area I want to ask you about today is when you look into your crystal ball and you think about what it's going to look like to grow a company like Abundant Energy, Abundant IoT, Abundant Power over the next 6, 12, 24 months. What do you think is going to change? And what do you think will stay the same?
Great question. Just a high level comment I'll make on that as I start. I feel, and this actually came from an investor. This was a quote from one of our investors. They said, power is the modern day gold rush, and you're the picks and shovels, right? And I was like, yes, someone gets it. I mean, I couldn't believe it when that was articulated to me, because that's exactly what we are. And that's exactly what this is. It is the modern day gold rush. So going back to the comment about the energy shifting in the next 3 to 5 years, that's an interesting opportunity right there, right, as it relates to this. But what's going to stay? I would say absolutely power. There's no question this is going to become a much bigger thing. In fact, I've talked to some people and they've asked me like, hey, what is this going to look like? It's not going to look like Waterworld where you're just trying to go somewhere to get it, but it's going to look probably more like Minority Report, but where you've got, this EV charging station, right? And depending where you're going, you could pay 10 times more. It's already happening, as we know. You pay more for charging in certain areas than you do in others. That's going to go on steroids. So if you're out in the middle of nowhere, we can give you a linear generator to power your EV charging. And then, of course, you can charge a much higher price for that. So again, not going to the level of like a Waterworld, but a very interesting change. And as far as what's going to go away or change, kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier. A slower sales motion is gone. Companies cannot scale and not survive without moving way faster at this time. And as it relates to the data center space, that's particularly true. Just because a lot of times, for example, they'll come to us for power, but they also want the transformers and other equipment. Well, that's a whole different conversation than if they just want the power, right? So anyway, bottom line, I would just say there's a, the power is going to be growing more and more. And, people have to step up and level up and move much faster.
As the word rush implies, right?
Right, exactly.
Not the gold crawl, not the gold stroll.
Yeah, that's why when I heard it, I was like, okay, that is exactly it. Can I borrow that? And I was given rights to borrow that.
Yeah, I had someone on who is a sales leader from Supermicro, the big semiconductor partner of NVIDIA servers. And yeah, there's a lot of companies throughout this that are using that as an analogy to try to underscore the urgency, because there actually are pockets of companies that are still moving very slowly, very conservatively with all this, and aren't appreciating the need to really truly be competitive with speed and agility.
I never thought it would be so important as it is right now. I mean, I literally have seen a few opportunities come in. I remember there was one came in at 4:00, and then replying back a few hours later, it's already gone. Then again, if you're talking about the TMRs, the bigger machines that are out there, by the time that you quote it, it's gone. So when you talk about speed to market, it's just unbelievable now.
It's like trading frequency, trading disk.
Yeah, exactly.
Vince, it's been really fascinating to get a window into what you're doing to build Abundant and how customer demand has taken you in a few interesting, unplanned directions for scaling your expertise to help different kinds of clients throughout operators and developers. If someone wants to follow what you're working on or reach out to you, is LinkedIn a good place to start?
LinkedIn's great. The website also has some nice interactive tools on it. AbundantIoT.com. And yeah, those would be the top two.
Cool. Yeah, we'll make sure to include links to your profile and your LinkedIn company page and your website, so listeners and viewers can get in touch if they have any additional questions. But yeah, I've really enjoyed our chat today. I've been speaking today with Vince Bradley, who is the CEO of Abundant IoT in Southern California. Thanks so much for joining, Vince.
Thank you so much, Joshua. Thanks everyone for listening.
Most data center GTM teams are flying completely blind. 83% of your buyer's journey is happening before they even speak with someone from your sales team. The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is powered by DCSMI. We've studied over 1,900 industry leaders to build a diagnostic framework that identifies exactly why deals fall apart and revenue stalls. Stop guessing and start benchmarking. Subscribe now to our weekly Data Center GTM briefing at www.dcsmi.com/briefing. Again, that's dcsmi.com/briefing. BRIEFING.